The Foolish Game. The autumn breeze scattered amber leaves across Westlake University's quad as Naomi Parker tossed her chestnut hair over her shoulder, barely paying attention to her friend Jasmine's animated chatter about the weekend's upcoming fraternity mixer. Naomi's senior year had begun with the same predictable rhythm of parties, occasional studying, and maintaining her carefully crafted social persona. Nothing had surprised her in 3 years. She knew every corner of campus, every professor's quirks, every social hierarchy. Boredom was settling in like an unwelcome house guest. "So what do you think about the new transfer guy?" Jasmine nudged her, gesturing toward a bench beneath a maple tree where a young man sat alone, his attention focused on a weathered paperback, seemingly oblivious to the bustling campus life around him. "Which one?" Naomi squinted, noticing him for the first time. He wasn't conventionally striking, lanky with tousled dark hair, round wire-rimmed glasses, and a quiet intensity about him. But something in his posture, the way he leaned into his book as if it were whispering secrets, caught her attention momentarily. Devin Thorne, transferred from some small liberal arts college upstate, English literature major, supposedly brilliant, but barely talks to anyone, Jasmine supplied, scrolling through her phone. Darian tried starting a conversation with him in World Lit yesterday and got one-word answers. Their friend Tyler approached, slinging his arm around Naomi's shoulders. "Who are we analyzing today?" "Bookworm on the bench," Jasmine replied, her eyes glinting mischievously. "Naomi was just saying how intriguing he looks." "I said no such thing," Naomi protested, though she found her gaze drifting back to him. "You know," Tyler said slowly, a familiar tone creeping into his voice that usually preceded trouble. "You've conquered every social challenge on this campus, Parker. Student government, Greek life, even charming Professor Hamilton into extending your thesis deadline." Jasmine caught his drift immediately. "But you've never cracked a genuine introvert. What are you suggesting?" Naomi asked, though she already knew. Tyler's grin widened. "End of semester formal is in 8 weeks. Bet you can't get him to ask you to be his date and actually fall for you in the process." Jasmine laughed. "That's impossible. He barely acknowledges people exist." "Exactly," Tyler countered. "A real challenge for once." Something flickered in Naomi's chest, irritation at Tyler's presumption, or perhaps at the casual way they discussed manipulating someone's feelings. Yet another part of her, the part that had been sleepwalking through senior year, awakened with interest. "What are the stakes?" she heard herself asking. "If you win, I'll write your final comparative literature paper," Tyler offered. "If you lose, you handle my winter break shift managing the alumni call center." The call center. 40 hours of mind-numbing phone calls during what should be vacation. Naomi grimaced. "You're on!" she declared, ignoring the tiny voice questioning the ethics of her decision. "But no interference from either of you." The next morning, Naomi arrived at the campus coffee shop 15 minutes earlier than usual, having noted from her reconnaissance that Devin stopped there daily before his 9 a.m. Victorian literature seminar. She positioned herself in line behind him, observing as he ordered a simple black coffee, no sugar, his voice soft but clear. When he fumbled for his wallet, she stepped forward. "I've got it," she said, handing the barista enough for both their orders. "Consider it a welcome to Westlake." Devin looked up, startled. His eyes were a deep brown, almost amber in the morning light, observant and surprisingly warm despite his reserved demeanor. "That's unexpected," he said, studying her with quiet intensity that made her feel strangely transparent. "Thank you, but why?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Most people simply accepted free things with gratitude, because sometimes small kindnesses make big differences, she improvised. "I'm Naomi Parker, by the way." "Devin Thorne," he replied, accepting his coffee. "Though something tells me you already knew that." Their eyes locked, and for a disorienting moment, Naomi felt as though he could see right through her carefully constructed facade to the wager underneath. "But that was impossible. English department, right?" she continued smoothly. "I've seen you in the humanities building. I'm in Professor Whitaker's contemporary fiction seminar." "Whitaker," he nodded, a flicker of genuine interest crossing his features. What are you reading now? Murakami's Kafka on the Shore, she answered truthfully. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd named something substantial rather than commercial fiction. What do you think about the parallel narratives? The question wasn't superficial small talk, and Naomi found herself responding thoughtfully, drawing on observations she'd never shared in class discussions where she typically offered safe, middle-ground opinions. Their conversation continued as they walked toward the Humanities building, and Naomi was startled to realize she'd forgotten about the bet entirely for several minutes. As they parted ways at the entrance, Devon hesitated. "Thanks again for the coffee and the conversation. Same time tomorrow?" Naomi suggested impulsively. A small, guarded smile appeared. "Maybe," he replied, but she caught the hint of anticipation in his voice. Walking away, Naomi felt an unexpected twinge of guilt. This would be easier than she thought, and somehow that didn't feel like victory at all. Unexpected pages, 3 weeks into what her friends now called the Devon Project, Naomi found herself sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet of the university library's literature section, surrounded by stacks of poetry anthologies. Across from her, Devon was animatedly explaining the subtle connections between T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and contemporary climate literature, a topic that would have bored her to tears a month ago, but now had her leaning forward, completely engaged. "Sorry," he said suddenly, catching himself mid-explanation. "I've been talking for 20 minutes straight." "Don't apologize," Naomi replied, surprised by her own sincerity. "It's fascinating. You see connections no one else does." A faint blush colored Devon's cheeks. "Most people tune out when I get like this." "I'm not most people," she said automatically, the practiced line falling from her lips before she could consider it. Yet for once, it didn't feel like a performance. Their study sessions had become a regular occurrence. Tuesdays and Thursdays in the library, occasional coffee before classes, and sometimes lunch at the quiet cafe off campus that Devon had introduced her to. Each meeting was supposed to be another calculated step toward winning the bet. But Naomi found herself taking fewer notes to share with Tyler and Jasmine, who were growing increasingly curious about her progress. "You've got to give us something juicy," Jasmine had insisted the previous night in their shared apartment. "Is he falling for you or not?" "It's complicated," Naomi had answered vaguely. "He's different, more perceptive than I expected." Now, watching Devon carefully place a bookmark in the poetry collection, she realized she'd begun looking forward to these quiet moments together more than the weekend parties and social events that had once defined her college experience. There was something liberating about their conversations, about being valued for her thoughts rather than her social capital. "I read your essay," Devon said unexpectedly, pulling a folded paper from his bag. It was her Murakami analysis, which she'd mentioned offhandedly last week. Professor Whitaker left it on display in the writing center. Naomi felt a rush of embarrassment. "You didn't have to—" "It's brilliant," he interrupted, his gaze direct and unguarded. "The way you traced the metaphysical journey through the character's psychological landscape, it's exactly what I've been trying to articulate in my own writing." No one in her social circle had ever taken her academic work seriously. Even Tyler, who was in several of her literature classes, treated their coursework as a necessary evil rather than a passion. Yet here was Devon, treating her ideas with genuine respect and interest. "I have something for you, actually," she said impulsively, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a vintage edition of Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood that she'd found in a small bookshop downtown. She'd spent an hour selecting it, imagining Devon's reaction to the thoughtfully annotated margins and distinctive cover art. His fingers brushed hers as he accepted the book, his expression shifting from surprise to a quiet delight that made something flutter in her chest. "This is the first translation," he said softly, carefully turning the pages. "How did you find this?" "I remembered you mentioned wanting to compare translations," she explained, oddly nervous. "It's not a big deal." But the way he looked at her then, as though seeing beyond the carefully curated image she presented to the world, made it feel like a very big deal indeed. Later that evening, walking back to her apartment under a canopy of stars. Naomi's phone buzzed with a message from Tyler. Progress report? Formal's only 5 weeks away. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The truth was, she hadn't thought about the bet in days. Instead, she'd found herself sharing things with Devin she'd never told anyone. Her secret ambition to become a literary critic. Her complicated relationship with her parents' expectations. Her fear that she'd spent 4 years building a persona at the expense of discovering who she really was. Working on it, she typed back, the words feeling hollow and dishonest in a way they never had before. Another message appeared, this time from Jasmine. Don't tell me you're actually falling for Book Boy. Naomi stared at the text, a weight settling in her stomach as she realized with startling clarity that the impossible had happened. The game had backfired. She, Naomi Parker, social strategist extraordinaire, was developing genuine feelings for the quiet transfer student she'd been tasked with manipulating, and when he inevitably discovered the truth, she would lose him completely. Truth in Shadows. The annual Halloween party at Westlake's most prestigious fraternity house was in full swing, strobe lights pulsing across costumed students, music thumping through antique floorboards, and the scent of pumpkin-spiced drinks mingling with the unmistakable odor of cheap beer. Naomi stood near the refreshment table, adjusting her Shakespearean costume and scanning the crowd. She hadn't expected Devin to attend. He'd mentioned disliking large gatherings, but he'd surprised her by agreeing to make an appearance. Your bookworm actually showed. Tyler appeared beside her, dressed as a zombie quarterback, his face painted gray and white. I'm impressed, Parker. Maybe you'll win this bet after all. Naomi flinched at the word bet, glancing around nervously. Keep your voice down, she hissed. And don't call him that. Tyler raised an eyebrow. Someone's protective. Don't tell me you've gone soft. It's not like that, she insisted, though the lie felt bitter on her tongue. Over the past 5 weeks, she'd found herself inventing excuses to see Devin. Literary discussions that stretched into dinner conversations, coffee meetups that lasted until the shop closed, long walks through campus discussing everything from medieval poetry to quantum physics. She spotted him then, standing awkwardly near the entrance, in what appeared to be a modest attempt at dressing as Ernest Hemingway, complete with a fisherman's sweater and a notebook peeking from his pocket. Their eyes met across the room, and the small, private smile that crossed his face sent a rush of warmth through her chest. I need to go, she told Tyler, moving away before he could respond. She had nearly reached Devin when Jasmine intercepted her, pulling her into a side conversation with several other friends. Naomi tried to extricate herself politely, keeping an eye on Devin, who had been cornered by an enthusiastic history major. So how close are you to sealing the deal? One of the girls asked, her voice carrying despite the music. Tyler says you've got him wrapped around your finger. Naomi felt her chest tighten. It's not like that, she said again, more firmly this time. Jasmine laughed. Please, the whole point was to make him fall for you before formal. Don't pretend you're not playing the game anymore. I'm not playing anything, Naomi snapped, uncharacteristically sharp. Just drop it, okay? Oh my God, Jasmine's eyes widened. You actually like him. This is priceless. The girl who's never had a serious relationship is falling for the quiet guy she was supposed to be manipulating. Would you lower your voice? Naomi pleaded, suddenly aware of how easily conversations could be overheard in the crowded room. She turned, intending to find Devin and suggest they leave, and found herself staring directly into his eyes. He stood just a few feet away, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to a cold, distant anger that made her stomach drop. How much had he heard? Enough, clearly. Devin, she began, but he was already turning away, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. Devin, wait! Naomi called, following him out onto the fraternity house's sprawling porch. The autumn night air was sharp with cold, a stark contrast to the stuffy heat of the party. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his back to her, shoulders rigid. A bet, he said quietly, the words falling between them like stones. That's what this whole thing was about. It started that way, she admitted, knowing that anything less than honesty would only worsen the situation. But it changed. I changed. He turned to face her, and the hurt in his eyes cut deeper than anger would have. How much was I worth? What did you stand to gain by making the quiet guy fall for you? It doesn't matter. None of that matters anymore. It matters to me, he insisted, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his expression. Was anything real? Or was I just this semester's entertainment? Everything these past few weeks has been real, she said desperately. The conversations, the books, everything I shared with you, that was all me, Devin. The real me. He shook his head slowly. How would I know the difference? You're apparently very good at this game. The word game struck her like a physical blow. It's not a game to me. Not anymore. I trusted you, he said simply, and the quiet devastation in his voice was worse than if he'd shouted. I thought, for the first time since transferring here, that I'd found someone who saw me, really saw me. I do see you, Naomi whispered, taking a step toward him. He stepped back. No, you saw a challenge, a project, and I was foolish enough to believe it was something more. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes refusing to meet hers. I need to go. Please, can we talk about this? She pleaded, reaching for him. I don't think there's anything left to say. With that, he turned and walked away, his figure dissolving into the darkness beyond the reach of the porch lights. Naomi stood alone in the cold, the sounds of the party continuing behind her as though nothing significant had happened, as though her world hadn't just collapsed around her. For the first time in her college career, she had no strategy, no clever words, no social maneuver to fix what she'd broken. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd won the bet by making Devin fall for her. But in doing so, she'd lost something far more valuable than she'd ever imagined possible. The empty frame November arrived with bitter winds and early sunsets, matching Naomi's mood perfectly. 2 weeks had passed since the Halloween party, and Devin had effectively vanished from her life, switching coffee shops, changing his study locations, even requesting a seat reassignment in their shared seminar. The few times she glimpsed him across campus, he turned away before she could approach. You still hung up on that guy? Tyler asked as they left class one afternoon. His tone was casual, but she caught the undercurrent of concern. It was just a bet, Naomi, not worth torpedoing your senior year over. It wasn't just a bet, she said quietly, the words emerging before she could stop them. Not to me, and definitely not to him. Tyler studied her for a moment. You really did fall for him, didn't you? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. For what it's worth, he said, uncharacteristically serious. I'm sorry. It was a stupid idea. Back in her apartment, Naomi stared at her laptop screen, her comparative literature assignment neglected as she found herself typing Devin's name into a search engine for what felt like the 100th time. Previously, nothing relevant had appeared. He had no social media presence, no digital footprint beyond the university directory. Today, however, a new result appeared, a literary analysis blog titled Marginalia. Curious, she clicked through to find a minimalist website with thoughtful essays on contemporary literature, poetry, and philosophical texts. The most recent entry, dated just 3 days ago, was titled Authenticity and Performance, The Modern Paradox of Connection. Heart-pounding, she began to read. The essay was unmistakably Devin's work, his distinctive analytical style woven through elegant prose, but the subject matter hit uncomfortably close to home. In a world where performance has replaced authenticity as our primary mode of interaction, how do we recognize genuine connection when it appears? More troublingly, how do we trust it when the lines between strategic social behavior and sincere emotion have become so expertly blurred that even the performers themselves may lose sight of their original motivations? The words cut through her defenses, laying bare the questions she'd been wrestling with since the night everything fell apart. As she continued reading, she realized the essay wasn't just abstract theory, it was about her, about them, about the brief, beautiful connection they'd shared before the truth destroyed it. Yet despite the hurt evident in every line, there was no malice, no public shaming. He'd transformed his pain into a thoughtful exploration of broader themes, never once mentioning her name or the specific circumstances. The final paragraph caught her breath. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is not the betrayal itself, but the uncertainty it creates, the lingering question of whether any of it was real. In the aftermath, both parties are left wondering if they imagined the authenticity they believed they'd found, if the connection that seemed to transcend ordinary interaction was merely another level of sophisticated performance. This uncertainty becomes its own prison, preventing either person from trusting similar connections in the future. Naomi closed her laptop, tears streaming down her face. He thought she'd been performing the entire time, that every moment of vulnerability, every shared insight, every genuine laugh had been calculated manipulation. And why shouldn't he? She'd given him every reason to doubt her authenticity. The next day, she skipped classes entirely, spending hours reading through the archives of Devon's blog. Each essay revealed new dimensions of his thoughtful mind, his sensitive observations, his quiet courage in facing difficult questions. Some were clearly written before they'd met. Others seemed inspired by their conversations, ideas they'd explored together, expanded and refined through his unique perspective. By evening, she'd made a decision. If Devon wouldn't speak to her, perhaps he would read her words. Opening a new document, she began writing, not an apology, though that would come later, but a response to his essay on authenticity. She poured everything into it, her lifelong struggle with social expectations, her gradual loss of identity behind carefully crafted personas, and most importantly, the awakening she'd experienced through knowing him. The most terrifying moment, she wrote, is not when the performance is revealed, but when the performer realizes that somewhere along the way, the act became truth, that the mask has grown into the face, making separation impossible. What then? Is transformation a valid path to authenticity or merely its ultimate counterfeit? When she finished, she created her own simple blog, a single page with her essay and contact information, and sent the link to his university email. Then she waited, understanding that she had no right to expect a response, but hoping that somehow her words might reach him. 3 days passed with no reply. Naomi moved through her classes like a ghost, barely registering the concerned glances from friends or the approaching deadlines for final projects. On the 4th day, returning from campus, she found a small package leaning against her apartment door, a book-shaped parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was her copy of Norwegian Wood that she'd lent Devon weeks ago, forgotten in the aftermath of their falling out. A slip of paper marked a page near the end, a single line highlighted, "What happens when people open their hearts? They get better." Below the quote, in Devon's neat handwriting, "Literary Society reading Hamilton Hall, Friday, 7 p.m. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even a promise of conversation. But it was an opening, a small crack in the wall between them that might, with care and patience, widen enough for understanding to pass through. For the first time in weeks, Naomi felt something like hope. Rewritten endings. Hamilton Hall was nearly full by the time Naomi arrived on Friday evening, slipping into a seat near the back of the auditorium. The Literary Society's end-of-semester reading was apparently more popular than she'd anticipated, with students and faculty filling the rows of wooden chairs. A program on her seat indicated that Devon would be reading original work in the second half of the event. As she waded through the initial presentations, poetry from the university's creative writing students, selections from faculty publications, Naomi found herself rehearsing what she might say if Devon actually spoke to her afterward. Every practiced opening line sounded hollow, insufficient against the weight of what had transpired between them. When Devon finally approached the podium, the room quieted. He looked different somehow, still reserved, but with a quiet confidence that hadn't been present before. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "What I'm sharing tonight isn't what was listed in your program," he said, his voice steady. "Instead, I'd like to read something I've been working on about second chances and authentic connections in a world that often prioritizes appearance over substance." Naomi felt her heart accelerate as he began reading. Not from his blog essay, but something new. something that wove together themes from their shared literary discussions with a narrative about two people discovering truth through falsity, genuine connection through artificial beginnings. Though fictional in form, the parallels to their situation were unmistakable. As his reading progressed, she realized with growing emotion that this was his response to her essay. Not a direct acknowledgement, but a creative dialogue continuing the conversation she'd attempted to restart. His story didn't offer easy forgiveness or a romantic resolution, but rather explored the complicated path of rebuilding trust after deception, of finding value in painful growth. When he finished, the applause was enthusiastic. Several professors nodded appreciatively, and Naomi could see why. His writing was exceptional, balancing intellectual depth with emotional resonance. As people began gathering their things, moving toward the reception in the adjacent room, she remained seated, uncertain whether to approach him or wait for some clearer sign. The decision was made for her when he appeared at the end of her row, hands in his pockets, expression guarded but not cold. "You came," he said simply. "You invited me," she replied, standing to face him. "At least I think you did." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I read your essay, and I heard your story." She hesitated. "It was beautiful." "It wasn't finished," he said after a moment. "The ending is still uncertain." The subtext wasn't lost on her. "Some stories take time to find their proper ending," she offered carefully. Around them, the auditorium had nearly emptied, the sounds of the reception filtering in from the hallway. "I can't pretend it didn't happen," Devon said finally, meeting her eyes directly. "The bet, the deception. It happened. And it hurt." "I know," she acknowledged. "I wouldn't ask you to pretend otherwise." "But," he continued as though working through a difficult passage in his mind, "I also can't pretend that what came after wasn't real. Your essay. It made me question whether I was being fair in dismissing everything between us." Naomi felt a surge of hope, tempered immediately by caution. "I meant every word," she said. "The bet may have brought me to you, but you brought me to myself. That's the truth. However it started." Devon nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about narrative structure lately. How the opening of a story doesn't dictate its conclusion. How characters can evolve beyond their initial framing." "And what have you concluded?" she asked softly. "That perhaps we both deserve the chance to write a different ending than the one we thought was inevitable." He glanced toward the exit, then back to her. "There's a coffee shop still open a few blocks from here. Not our usual place, but somewhere new. Neutral ground." The invitation wasn't grand or romantic. It wasn't even an explicit forgiveness. But it was an opportunity, a blank page where something honest might begin. "I'd like that," she said, gathering her coat. As they walked side through the chilly November evening, Naomi recognized that rebuilding what they'd lost would take time. Genuine trust always did. But for the first time, she wasn't thinking about social strategies or calculated responses. She wasn't playing a role or trying to win a game. She was simply walking beside someone who had seen the worst of her manipulations and the best of her authenticity. Someone who challenged her to reconcile those opposing forces into a more integrated self. Whether their story would ultimately be a romance, a friendship, or something undefined entirely, she couldn't predict. What mattered was that it would be true, a narrative shaped by genuine connection rather than performance, by forgiveness rather than perfect beginnings. Later, sitting across from him in the warm light of the unfamiliar coffee shop, watching him thoughtfully stir his black coffee, still no sugar, Naomi realized something profound. The bet that had begun as a foolish game had indeed made her the love of his life, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. He had made her fall in love with her authentic self, the person she'd been hiding behind carefully constructed social personas for years. "So," Devon said, setting down his spoon, "tell me something true. and in that simple invitation was everything. Challenge, opportunity, and the chance to begin again, this time, without pretense. "My name is Naomi Parker," she began, a smile forming at the corner of her mouth. "And I'm still learning who that actually is. But I'd very much like to find out, if you're willing to be part of that journey." He considered her words, his expression thoughtful. Then, reaching across the table, he gently turned to a fresh page in the notebook he always carried. "A new chapter," he said softly, offering her a pen. It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a cinematic resolution, just a quiet beginning, fragile and honest and real. And that, Naomi realized, was exactly the kind of love story worth writing.